Thank, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I'm going to focus my questions to begin with respect to Canada's import ban on goods produced in whole or in part by forced labor. So I leave it to you to decide who's best placed to respond to those questions. First, in April of this year, Customs and Border Protection in the U.S. issued a withhold release order against Taipong's salt farm, which is located in South Korea, on reasonable suspicion that forced labor was used in the production of the goods sea and salt products. Can you confirm whether such products are in Canada right now?
I'm sorry, I'm unable to confirm whether or not those products are in Canada. I don't have that information in front of me right now. We're happy to take that question back and provide you any information we do have after the session. Thank you.
In May of this year, Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold release order against Zaifan 7, a Chinese-flagged vessel, and will detain all seafood harvested by that vessel, again on reasonable suspicion that the vessel uses forced labor to harvest that seafood. Can you confirm whether that seafood has entered Canada?
Madame la Présidente, I again, am unable to confirm details of the questions that are being asked. We are aware of 54 withhold and release orders that have been issued by CBP and that are in effect. I can perhaps provide a little bit of information in terms of what CBSA is doing with respect to enforcement and engagement with importers into Canada, if that's of interest to the committee.
I will get to that, okay, those questions as well. I have some questions on that, but last one for you from this year. In September 24th of this year, Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold release against Giant Manufacturing Co. in respect of bicycles, bicycle parts, and accessories. Can you confirm whether Giant bicycles are available for sale in Canada?
Again, Madam President, I'm not in a position to be able to comment on the specific details of the question, but happy to take those three questions away and endeavor to provide information back to the committee after the meeting.
Thank you, and I would look forward to that information. You're aware that Giant Manufacturing Co. is the largest bicycle producer in the world. It's widely available bicycles in Canada. There are 2 stores in Ottawa, multiple in the GTA. Do you know if those bicycles were made with forced labor?
Again, Madam President, I am aware of Giant Bicycle and the stores that are in Ottawa. I am not in a position to comment on the specifics related to imports that may or may not have come into Canada from that manufacturer and whether or not those were produced whole or in part using forced labor.
I guess it's a little concerning to me as a member of Parliament that we have public declarations from Customs and Border Protection about products that are, in their opinion, produced under reasonable suspicion of being produced by forced labor. Some of those products are clearly available in Canada. Bicycles probably the most obvious example. If I'm wrong, you can correct me. So I want to know, how can we trust this is a priority for the CBSA if even on the most simple products that have been widely reported on, we have no answer from the CBSA on whether they have investigated them, considered them, taken any steps to ensure that those products are not being sold to Canadians?
If it's of interest, Madam President, to the committee, I'm happy to outline some of the efforts that CBSA is undertaking on a daily basis with respect to targeting goods entering the Canadian economy that are under suspicion of being produced using forced labor, some of the enforcement action and some of the proactive engagements that we've had with industry who have imported goods that we believe have a reasonable suspicion of potentially being produced using forced labor. If that's of interest, I'm happy to provide that testimony.
You mentioned the standard of reasonable suspicion. Is that the CBSA's legal standard for whether they will interdict goods?
The customs tariff uses the standard of balance of probabilities in terms of our authority to examine goods under the Customs Act. There's a no threshold authority for us to examine goods entering Canada. I could perhaps turn to my colleague Alex Lawton, who could provide more details from an operational perspective in terms of some of the work that we're doing and the standards that are used, if that's of interest to the committee.
You have more details on the specific standard, because I'd like to know about that, because it It seems unclear to me what the standard the CBSA applies is to determine whether a shipment should be flagged as high risk. And then it's unclear to me the CBSA standard for issuing a redetermination of tariff classification under Section 59 of the Customs Act.
So the standard, I'll start with the final question. So the standard for issuing a redetermination or to determine that the goods essentially have been made with forced labor is a balance of probabilities. In terms of actually detaining the goods, that's not where the balance of probabilities does not come into that. It's essentially based on high-risk imports. What is high risk? It comes down to knowing who the entities are who are importing or exporting the goods and who are within that supply chain, and knowing the potential of those entities for having forced labor within their each company within that supply chain. So based on that, if we have the research available to indicate that there is at least a suspicion, a high risk of suspicion of forced labor, we can make the detention, request additional information from the importer, from the person entity bringing in the goods, and based on that additional information as well as the information we already have, we make a decision on the balance of probabilities whether goods were made with forced labor.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fonseca for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my questions will be open to all of our witnesses, whoever may best answer. So this is somewhat following up on what MP Mantle was speaking about. So how does the CBSA currently identify shipments that may involve forced labor risk, and what information gaps limit reliable detection at the border? So do you see gaps that you have at the border? How can you close those gaps?
Thank you very much, Madam President, for the question. I would say that there's a lot of operational cooperation that is going on with partners that have forced labor regimes, including regular conversations with the U.S. to learn in terms of how they have implemented their forced labor ban over the course of almost the last 100 years, increasingly under the construct of trilateral discussions related to CUSMA, exchanges with the Mexican counterparts as well in terms of technical cooperation as well as information sharing around goods being imported into the North American economy that might be suspected of being produced with forced labor. There is also risking taking place through our CBSA systems to look at entities of concern and importers that may be bringing those goods into Canada. I think data, obviously, is something that is important in these type of investigations and this type of targeting. We need to know where goods are being produced and to be able to appropriately target them and to be able to intervene at a port of entry in order to undertake the enforcement action that Mr. Lawton walked us through earlier.
Thank you. And since 2020, how many shipments have been detained under the forced labor import ban, and in which sectors do you see the highest risk?
I'm not myself an operational person within CBSA. I will turn to my colleague Alex, who manages the program that does that type of operational engagement.
Yeah, so there have been 48 detentions since that time of individual shipments. Generally, those shipments have been in the garments, textiles, automotive parts, solar panels, more recently gloves and drones.
Well, thank you for that. And do we hear bicycles? Is that another one? Or
As of to date, there has not yet been a detention of bicycles, no.
Okay. So what challenges does the CBSA face in verifying the production of origin of goods that pass through complex supply chains or intermediary countries? How do you address
Thank you, Madam President. It's a very good question. I think part of the challenge is obviously supply chain traceability. Goods are made up of multiple components and often pass through multiple chains of production before they're imported into Canada. And supply chain traceability remains a challenge for CBSA in terms of its enforcement of the current forced labor ban.
That is an issue. So how do you decide, like, the documentation that you receive from importers, is it sufficient? Is it clear? How do you address that? Do you suspend or any documentation that is not clear involving any forced labor?
Thanks again for the question. I would say there's quite a robust recourse process that exists within the Customs Act. It has several layers that concludes at a quasi-judicial hearing. Through that process, there's an active discussion back and forth between the agency as well as with the importers to try to obtain the information from them in order to make an appropriate tariff classification on whether or not those goods were or were not produced via forced labor.
How often would the CBSA review the effectiveness of its current forced labor screening since 2020, and what have been your findings? So when was the last review that you did?
I would maybe defer to my colleague, Mr. Lawton, in terms of the operational arm of the CBSA, in terms of when reviews were undertaken last.
So the review of our risking process, or risking methodology, is basically an evergreen process, so we're constantly looking at it. The biggest gaps we found are essentially, it's an information deficit, both in terms of supply chain, but also in terms of working conditions within each entity within a supply chain. It's something that's very difficult to address. Many importers aren't even necessarily aware of their entire supply chain. That's the biggest gap, and that's one we're trying to address as much as possible, leveraging information from partner agencies such as the United States Customs and Border Protection, as well as partner agencies here within Canada, such as the SDC's labor program.
Thank you. This will be more of a trade question. So does Canada require additional trade agreement mechanisms to deal with forced labor issues moving forward? And maybe you can tell us about the ones that we have in place now.
This question. Madam Chair, I'm not, the committee may appreciate that I'm not really in a position to say what Canada needs in terms of new trade agreements. We have the import ban that is part of CUSMA. We have various other free trade agreements that include labor provisions and environmental provisions. But decisions on the future of Canada's free trade agreements and what it will include, those decisions will be taken at a future date.
And those would adhere to what you were saying, the OECD guidelines you had mentioned?
Madam Chair, the OECD guidelines are, the OECD is an intergovernmental body that consists of a membership, but the OECD RBC guidelines include other countries that are not OECD members, and it's a guideline of best practices. So it's advice to the entire international community, whether it's the business community, but also governments. What we do with the OECD guidelines as the Trade Commissioner Service is we provide advice to our clients who are largely exporters of goods and services, and we provide them our best advice based on those guidelines. And those guidelines are comprehensive. They include labor, they include environment, human rights. One of the things that we do encourage our exporters to do is to undertake due diligence, including related to forced labor that could be in their supply chains. Our exporters are exporting to foreign markets, but they will also, they may also be importers and import intermediary goods into their manufacturing process. So it is important we encourage our businesses to undertake due diligence because it is ultimately in their interest.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci à
Thank
vous.
you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming. To begin with, I have a question that may be naive but comprehensive. When I looked at a question, I would say that the figures that you gave, they go back 7 years. Canada seized about 34 cargoes at the border where there was forced labor involved, and that 33 of them were released. And this is all regions included. There's only one that was really seized and without being released. In the United States, they spend billions of dollars from coming from one region of China. Can you explain this discrepancy?
Yeah, sure.
Madam Chair, I think it would be very difficult for us here to comment on the laws and practices and regulations of a foreign government, but I'm sure my colleagues from CBSA would be very pleased to speak to how they approach this important issue.
Do we have people from CBSA? Do we have anybody from CBSA today? Please go ahead. Because the ball's been put into your court now.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the question. I will answer in English, and I would have my colleague Alex to jump in if required.
The import ban that Canada does have in place, the ban itself sits within the customs tariff that falls under the Ministry of Finance. That works in conjunction with the Customs Act, which is underneath the Minister of Public Safety, and together provide a very strong ban on forced labor. It's an absolute ban within the customs tariff. But then because of that very high threshold in terms of being able to ban all imports into Canada, there's also a case-by-case determination in terms of goods coming in, where that is then applied or not, and a rigorous and robust recourse process that follows. What we've seen from that is we have slightly different statistics and volume of enforcement than perhaps some of our other counterparts, including those in the U.S., But what we have been able to do is also work proactively through elements under my Minister of Public Safety and under former Bill S-211 in terms of putting in place a transparency regime to ensure that Canadian businesses are looking into their supply chain and ensuring that they're rooting out forced labor practices from within that. There's been proactive engagement undertaken by CBSA in terms of issuing trade advisory notices to companies importing into Canada, a variety of sectors that we understand could be susceptible to forced labor, as well as obviously enforcement action that have been referenced by the committee member as well. There are more updated stats in terms of what action has been undertaken by the CBSA other than the ones that were publicly quoted by the member. I'm happy to defer to my colleague Alex Lawton if he wants to talk about some of the more recent enforcement action if it's of interest to the committee.
Please go ahead if you have any figures that would be helpful.
November 2025, so as of this month, there have been 48 detentions. 2 have resulted in fine determinations of forced labor. One of those determinations was later on appeal overturned, essentially. In addition, there were 33 shipments that were released following information provided by the importers. The other 8, and hopefully my numbers are correct, the other 8 shipments, 7 were re-exported. Essentially, when we attempted to detain the goods, the exporter or importer decided that rather than allow their goods to be detained in a warehouse and the process to work its way out, they moved their goods outside of Canada. And the remainder were abandoned and essentially destroyed rather than the process working itself out. The importer abandoned the goods and essentially gave up ownership.
Donc là, si je comprends bien, donc 8.
So 8. So we were talking about 48 detentions. So out of these 48 detentions, 8 were sent back, and of the 2 that were, the 2 remaining were released. Have I understood correctly?
37 have been released, 2 were prohibited, 7 were re-exported, and 1 was abandoned.
Ça en fait 10 qui ne sont pas entrés sur le territoire.
So 10 shipments did not get accepted into Canada. Is that do you think their system is the definition of a strong system?
I wouldn't be appropriate for me as an official to criticize.
Vous qui avez parlé d'un modèle qui était fort. Là,
you talked about a strong system. I'm using your words.
My reference to a strong system was specifically related to the fact that the ban is absolute. There are no ability to import goods made by forced labor for other reasons into Canada. We have seen other regimes around the world where there are carve-outs for goods, even if they're determined to be produced by forced labor, to still enter other economies if there is a domestic need for the good, for example, whereas Canada's ban itself is absolute. But that comes with, obviously, a very high degree of rigor when it comes to a case-by-case assessment on the goods and the enforcement action undertaken by the agency.
Donc, ça veut dire que là,
Thank you.
So that means
All right, Mr. Gurlow, please, for 5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, bonjour. Bonjour, chers invités.
thank you to the witnesses. Forced labor. Ms. Esler, have I pronounced your name correctly? You work for public safety. What's your role at the department exactly?
My role in particular is the Director of Crime Prevention and Community Safety. I work on such elements as the National Crime Prevention Strategy and other community safety measures. Chad Westmacott, Director General of the Community Safety Corrections and Criminal Justice Directorate, was supposed to be here this morning, and he is directly responsible for measures under the Supply Chains Act.
Merci. Est-ce que la sécurité routière...
Thank you. Does highway safety come under your department's jurisdiction?
de travail forcé, puis je vais faire...
We talk about forced labor, and I'd like to tie this into public safety. Or do you condemn forced labor throughout the world? And which we call modern slavery. Do you condemn that throughout the world?
Madam Chair, on behalf of colleagues here, in my view, it's not really necessary for us to declare ourselves on an issue, but I think generally humanity would consider forced labor to be an abhorrent practice.
Voulez-vous juste répéter qu'est-ce que vous dites, là, s'il vous plaît?
Could you please repeat just what you said so that we understand correctly?
I think most people would agree that humanity would consider forced labor an abhorrent practice.
Donc, est-ce que vous condamnez qu'il existe...
We do have forced labor here in Canada in 2025. We do have forced labor, especially with Drivers, Inc. We force people to work 40 hours per week, and if they don't arrive on time, they're going to have to pay the bill. So we threaten them and their families. Miss Esther, we're forcing people to continue working without taking any breaks, with any pauses. Is there a tie here with public safety? Yes or no?
Madam Chair, the member is raising a very important issue that I believe covers the mandates of many federal and provincial and perhaps even municipal governments, entre autres ESDC, Transport Canada. So it may be worth following up with some of those departments. I don't think any of us at this table currently are working on that specific file.
On va parler du Service frontalier du Canada, peut-être?
We'll talk about the CBSA, perhaps. I would like to have you answer my question. How do you explain that the shipments are not intercepted for reasons of forced labor in Canada? Our allies have comparable mechanism, and they seize a lot more shipments. Is it about efficiency? What's the reason? How do you explain that?
Thank you, Madame la Présidente, for the question. I don't want to speculate in terms of future enforcement action, but I can speak a little bit to the results that we've had over the 5 years that the ban has roughly been in place. For the CBSA, it's a new line of business in terms of trying to identify these goods coming into Canada. the inherent quality, as I'm sure the committee can appreciate, is different for forced labor goods or goods produced by forced labor than other goods. At the end of the day, in a dockyard, opening up a container of footwear, a shoe looks like a shoe, and from a customs tariff perspective, there's all sorts of different subcomponents of the tariff code, whether or not it has a leather sole, a rubber sole, et cetera. All those are physical, visible, distinguishing features of a shoe that we can easily assess and have our officers assess. What is more difficult is to try to make the determination about how those goods have been produced and the labor conditions that exist in the factory where those goods have been produced. And one box of shoes in the exact same container may have been produced in a factory that is perfectly acceptable with no forced labor present, while other ones were. And so it has been a bit of a process for us to learn from our partners, including the U.S., including from the Mexicans. And recently as well, the EU has passed new regulations related to forced labor. And so also learning from partners in the European Union. My colleague Alex spoke earlier about some of the enforcement successes that we've had. Underpinning all of that action is, in fact, daily scans of imports coming into Canada. We do have a long list of entities that we know have a high degree of high potential for forced labor production, and so we scan goods and importers for those names to try to identify whether or not those shipments are coming in. We've done proactive engagement with the Canadian importing community to flag not only the rules and the laws that exist today, but also to flag imports of potential concern, supplemented with the role that my colleague plays or her boss plays at public safety in terms of the supply chain legislation that was brought forward under S211 and trying to make sure that Canadian businesses are looking into their supply chain as well. It's trying to incentivize good behavior within the Canadian importing community. That, coupled with the backstop of our forced labor import ban, is producing results, and they stand as reported by my colleague.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lavoie, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank our witnesses for attending here today. I have two questions. First of all, please clarify, Mr. Lawton, Mr. Hutchinson, since the very start when we began our work on this issue, I have the impression that the only measure that we have is in terms of looking at the shipments. We look at shipments coming into Canada or going to the U.S. That must not be the only measure that's taken in order to prevent forced labor. Do you have other measures, other specific activities that you do that you could share with us? Because I hear you talking about shipments, but there must be other aspects to this as well.
Madam Chair, the member raises a very good point that this important issue requires more than just seizures and enforcement by an agency like CBSA. It requires an education process for the importer community. These are very valuable businesses in Canada that face all kinds of economic pressures. It's really important that they have an education about the risks, because one of our strongest areas of focus is trying to build more resilience within our business community, trying to grow the economy. And it's important for them to understand the risks to their bottom line in being part of supply chains with forced labor. In our view, the Supply Chains Act has had a major impact in terms of bringing awareness to the business community. Thousands of businesses must submit an annual report, and in doing so have instituted new policies within their corporate structures. It's a hallmark of their ESG policies. So I think it is an important consideration to think beyond simply regulation and enforcement.
OK. Monsieur Lawton avait une réponse?
Mr. Lawton, do you wish to say anything?
Yes, so just to supplement what my colleague has said, from a CBSA perspective, we completely recognize that stopping individual shipments on that shipment by shipment basis is not the only effective way to address the problem of forced labor and to implement the import prohibition. So more recently, in August 2025, we supplemented that approach with an educational campaign. Essentially, we leveraged what we call trade advisory notices to notify approximately 1,800 companies who are what we identified as most at risk of bringing in goods representing a high risk of having forced labor in their supply chains.
Je vais vous arrêter parce que je vois monter filer, puis j'ai une autre question, puis c'est en lien avec
I
ce que
have
vous...
another question which ties into what Mr. Hutchinson, you talked about educating businesses going through the chambers of commerce, etc. You said that it's very... Some people have said that when it comes to the supply chain, yes, they have to be competitive, but just in Quebec alone, 72% of businesses have less than 12 employees. Do we need a system for the bigger companies? In Quebec, 72% of businesses have 10 or fewer employees, and they don't have the financial means, well, even to be able to provide the education. How can you help these businesses at the source? How can you help them so that they can remain competitive but also comply with the law?
As part of educational efforts with Canadian companies, I can speak to the Trade Commissioner Service. That certainly a core element of its service offering and support to Canadian exporters involves responsible business conduct education. But in terms of the broader business community, which is certainly in Canada composed of many SMEs and micro-sized businesses, I think it takes a community of action. And in that regard, I would point to business associations as being very important partners, along with provincial governments. So I think it takes a whole of Canada effort on an important issue like this.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you. I've heard during various visits to Washington, there were people who were saying that they suspected that Chinese solar panels that were blocked at the American border and refused in Canada were simply shipped to Canada. And some wrote letters about this. This is in the public domain. Can you confirm whether this is possible?
Yeah, thank you, Madame la Présidente. I will defer to my colleague Alex to sort of answer in detail in terms of what generally happens in terms of passage of goods between Canada and the States. The issue of re-exportation, I think you heard in earlier testimony, is something that Canada has faced as well when we've detained goods suspected of forced labor, that the importer have chosen to re-export those goods to another market rather than have them detained in Canada. That's a feature and something that's available to exporters bringing goods into Canada, that they can re-export them. So maybe, Alex, if you've got anything specific on the cases that the member mentioned, but if not, I would say that is a feature of Canadian import and export business.
Puis juste avant votre explication, je vous ajoute tout de suite une...
I would add, and it's a question as well, when goods are denied at the American border under their the Uyghur forced labor regulations, what happens then?
As a matter of course, we are aware of any goods that are turned away at the United States border and then are re-exported to Canada. And every one of those shipments is essentially given a review at the time that they present themselves at the Canadian border. That's where the difficulty is, because of the Canadian forced labor import prohibition is based on a tariff classification. It's not based on a given region or a given industry. It's based on the individual entities. So when those goods arrive in Canada, we'll look at the entities that we know of to see if there are any indications that forced labor is present within those specific entities. If there are none, we will generally, the goods are allowed release. If there are indications, those goods can be detained, the importer can be contacted, additional research will be done, information sought, and a decision will be made at that point as to whether the goods are made with forced labor or not, and the tariff classification decision made.
Thank you very much. Mr. McKenzie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hutchinson, the Trade Commissioner Service, you've referred to a campaign of information. I laud that effort. I am certain that there are many who need to better understand the issues around forced labor in different parts of the world and so on. But it is also the case, is it not, that the Trade Commissioner Service is really a facilitative organization. It facilitates and assists Canadians and Canadian enterprises in trade, as opposed to being an enforcement agency.
Madam Chair, that is absolutely correct. The Trade Commissioner Service provides a free service of an advisory service to Canadian exporters and does not have any kind of enforcement mandate.
Is there any kind of obligation or direction to trade commissioners in our embassies and consulates missions around the world to report circumstances or information that may come to their attention that would be of use to your colleagues to your right?
Madam Chair, the member speaks to a challenging element in terms of the mandate of the Trade Commissioner Service and Global Affairs Canada. Our mandate is related to the export of Canadian goods and services. And we do not have a mandate, an extraterritorial mandate to investigate or look into nefarious activities of foreign entities. That said, there could be situations in which our well-trained trade commissioners come across a Canadian company and there may be concerns about responsible business conduct. And in that case, our trade commissioners would certainly engage with that company to better understand what is going on. And at the end of the day, trade commissioner services are discretionary and can be withdrawn.
Thank you. Mr. Lawton, you referred to the interception of 48 shipments over a period of 5 years. Just to give us a rough ballpark, how many shipments is that 48 from? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions?
In terms of the proportion of goods detained as total imports, given that the forced labor import prohibition potentially covers any good shipped in or imported into Canada, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it's safe to say it would be 48 out of a fairly significant number.
Fair enough. It strikes me that your organization would benefit from greater information networks. Are those in place now? Are they being expanded upon? Obviously, your work is principally domestic within Canadian borders. The Trade Commissioner Service is outward focused. Who's looking at what's happening in other parts of the world so that we can identify things at their source beyond what we already know in order to identify those goods as they come down, as Mr. Hamilton referred to, a rather complicated, I'm sure often enough, supply chain?
I think I referenced previously the information deficit as being a significant challenge when it comes to enforcing the import prohibition. In terms of networks, the CBSA has established a range of networks involving NGOs, other government departments, and partner agencies elsewhere in the world. It's not so much the lack of information networks, so much as the lack of information. A lot of the information in this space, a lot of the research in terms of forced labor have concentrated on regions or countries or industries without getting into specific entities necessarily. The entity level information is really what is required in order to implement the import prohibition, the import ban. So it's an evolution. The more research that is done over time, the more information we have on specific entities, the more specific entities we're able to identify, the better we're able to risk. The other challenge is research can be done on a great number of entities who are using forced labor or allegedly using forced labor in their supply chains. If those entities there's public information that they're doing so, if those entities never actually export to Canada or may never show up in Canadian supply chains. The import prohibition's in place, but we really don't have an opportunity to take action against those entities because we never see them.
It strikes me that generally the legislation is in place. We know what we need to prohibit, and the legislation is there. So are we lacking government policy, government commitment to make this happen, or just the resources on the ground?
Yeah, thank you, Madam President, for the question. It's a difficult one to answer, simply as we are learning to implement, trying new things. It's an evolution in terms of understanding how best to take this very difficult to target commodity and use our tariff classification import ban that we have now, and to ensure that we've got good enforcement action, and more importantly, enforcement action that sticks. I think when we look at the numbers that my colleague Mr. Lawton has presented today, a fair number of those were subsequently released into the Canadian economy, and we want to make sure that when we take enforcement action, that enforcement action sticks. And so it's a bit of a learning process for us. Obviously, we've touched a little bit on the information deficit. Obviously, there's a number of priorities at the border. The CBSA is in charge of enforcing over 100 different acts and thousands of different regulations that come into play on goods that come into the country. There's obviously a huge focus on supply chain and supply chain fluidity. We don't want to necessarily be a roadblock. We already understand that borders and ports can be seen as a choke point, and we want to make sure that that's moving through, but that we're also undertaking the very important enforcement component of our mandate, and not just the facilitative one. And so that's all balanced. Mr. Lawton spoke a little bit to the risk-based approach that we're taking. We're trying to ensure that we're assigning resources against the risks that we've identified, but it is a challenge, and it is an evolution on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Madame Lapointe.
In Quebec, we are very active in the textile industry. How do you do risk evaluations with respect to forced labor? You recall China, where we get a lot of textiles that come in from China.
So from a risk perspective, the first step is essentially identifying a given commodity, such as textiles, from a given country or region. At that point, we have a basis to begin more in-depth research into the entities involved in that region, that industry. So, for example, the textiles from a specific area of China. That's where the difficulty really starts, is that we know we need to look for entities within that area, within that industry. What we'll generally do in our approach is we'll be able to articulate that information need, and then begin using our information networks to try to determine what information is available concerning, in this case, specific textile manufacturers, specific textile entities within a given area of China, whether it be other partner departments here in Canada, such as the ESDC with their labor program, publicly available research, or information that's been found by the United States, for example. We'll begin to gather information on those specific entities, and then start placing those entities within supply chains that supply Canada. And if we're able to do all that, then we're able to link it to specific importers, specific shipments, and make that detention action, take that detention action.
Donc, est-ce que vous travaillez avec l'ambassade à Beijing?
Do you work with the embassy in Beijing, or do you work primarily with other countries where they're, when we're dealing with problems in China?
Madam Chair, I would say that the important issue of forced labor is a whole of government effort. CBSA is not alone. There's a number of departments that work collaboratively with them on this issue. Our embassies, especially the trade commissioners, do not have a mandate to monitor imports into Canada. The central focus of the Trade Commissioner Service is to seize opportunities in foreign markets by selling our goods and services in those markets. Okay.
Venez par l'avoir. Bon.
You said that you do stop shipments. Is that the only measure you're looking at?
Vous aussi?
No, we are looking at the other measure that the CBSA has implemented or is implementing is what we call a trade advisory notice. It's an educational notice to importers who we've identified as importing goods that are at a high risk of forced labor, whether it be because of the industry or the region.
Excusez, mon temps avance. Est-ce que ça va être...
Pardon me. So, do you focus on the ports, for example, the Port of Vancouver? Is where this is all taking place?
Generally, when it comes to detentions, the detentions take place at the port. When we talk about educational efforts and importers, they could be across Canada.
Vous savez sûrement qu'il y a des nouvelles chaînes.
You know that there are new Chinese companies that are sending us packages that are available on the Canadian market. Do you look at the provenance of these packages arriving from China?
One of the factors we do look at when we're trying to determine whether goods are made with forced labor or what goods to detain is it's the entity ultimately. But that entity decision, identifying those companies, those exporters, necessarily involves looking at certain countries, certain regions, certain industries that'll eventually lead us to the entity. So yes, we do consider the country of origin and the country of export when identifying goods to detain.
I would just maybe add one quick clarification, if possible. Your earlier question was whether or not these detentions take place in ports of entry, like Port of Montreal or Port of Vancouver. That is absolutely true, they do, but the customs tariff, as well as the application of the Customs Act, is not limited to just the marine ports of entry. It could equally take place at airports for courier shipments that are coming in. It could equally be applied in warehouses where goods are held in bond as well. So there's a broad application. It's not limited to just marine ports. So the ability for us to enforce the forced labor ban is not just strictly limited to marine shipments.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Mantle for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lawton, you referred to high-risk goods or entities as one of the metrics you use to determine whether to interdict goods. Would goods or a company that's been identified by the Customs and Border Protection Agency of the United States as problematic make that high risk, in your opinion?
It's definitely one of the factors we look at. It's a risk indicator by all means. From that point, it's one risk indicator. That'll be the starting point for our research. What was the basis for the United States making that decision? They do have a lower bar in terms of the standard of evidence. Can we supplement whatever they have to put it to the position
so have you looked at Giant Bicycle Co. and the bicycles in Canada? Have you investigated that?
That, to be honest, I'm not sure about specific entities and to what extent we've looked at that specific entity. I think it would have to be something we'd have to get back to.
Mr. Hamilton, you spoke about the import ban as being a strong measure because it's a complete ban and we don't need carve-outs. Well, let me suggest to you that the ban is a paper tiger if you don't enforce it. And from the evidence that we've heard today, it seems to me that our enforcement is lacking, and I'm trying to figure out why that is. Is there a lack of institutional capacity? Is there a lack of political will to enforce this? You said this was a new line of business. I'm not persuaded by that. This was negotiated in the last CUSMA when it was created and was agreed in 2020. It's been 5 years. How many more years do we need for the CBSA to be serious about forced labor?
Thank you very much, Madam President, for the question. I would say CBSA is serious about ensuring that it implements the laws of Canada, this one being one of them. As my colleague, Mr. Lawton, has already testified, there's active approaches being undertaken on a daily basis related to this, and we stand behind that work.
How should we measure your success? If you come back in a year, how should we measure if you've been successful in enforcing this ban then? You said you said there's the will, you said there's capacity, so how should we measure that?
I'm sorry, Madam President, I'm not in a position to articulate what an appropriate measure of success would be in a future state.
You also mentioned that the import ban is more widely available as a tool. As you're probably aware, it's illegal to possess prohibited goods anywhere in the country under the Customs Act. Is my understanding correct? So no matter where they are, whether they're at a port of entry, in a warehouse, or sitting on an EV battery sitting on a car manufacturer's factory floor, it's illegal to possess goods that are illegally imported. Is that correct? Under the Customs Act?
I don't want to speculate. I'm not sure of that off the top of my head.
Have you conducted any trade compliance verifications post-importation with respect to forced labor?
Madam President, I may defer to my colleague, Alex. I work on the strategic policy side of CBSA, looking at existing authorities that are in place, but on the operational side, in terms of the activities related to enforcement that are being undertaken, I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Lawton.
Generally, trade compliance verification actions don't look at prohibited goods. Prohibited goods, the primary means of enforcing any sort of import prohibition is at the border.
Right. To me, that seems like a gap, because if things get through the border, then they get through the border. With respect to other trade programs, CBSA vigorously enforces and audits. If they're looking for government revenue, they will audit all the time. But it seems like you're not doing that with forced labor. You spoke about educational activities. Why don't you publish information about the companies that are involved, the goods that are involved, and where those goods were made? If I go on the CBP's website right now, there's a dashboard, as I'm sure you're aware, for withhold release orders and the UFLPA. Why is there nothing similar? Why doesn't the importing community know what activities the CBSA is taking?
Thank you very much, Madam President, for the comment. There is certain information that has been made available by the CBSA in the format of the trade advisory notifications that were referenced by Mr. Lawton earlier. There's obviously our public departmental memos that are posted. There's websites hosted by the Department of Public Safety as well, related to forced labor. And those are the activities that we're currently undertaking. I may defer to Mr. Hutchinson if he wants to provide anything more in terms of the broader Government of Canada approach to awareness around forced labor.
I'm interested in the importing community, so I'm sorry, I don't want to, don't need to hear about the Trade Commissioner Services aspect there. I have one more question. The D memo with respect to forced labor is dated 2021. There was a proposal to revise that. Where's that proposal? Will it be revised? That's the only public information we have, really, about how the CBSA enforces that. What's the status of that?
It is currently in the final stages of revision and is expected to be published very shortly. I don't have a specific date.
What does very shortly mean? Can you be a little more specific? Are we talking 1 quarter, 2 quarters, more?
I wouldn't want to commit myself, because as soon as I do, I suspect something will happen. But within
commitments also encourage people to fulfill them. So
I suspect within the next quarter, by the end of fiscal 2020, so by March 2026, that should be published.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Navki, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all of you for being here and the hard work that you do. This is obviously the kind of line of work that requires probably a lot of international cooperation to work with other jurisdictions. Wanted to hear your feedback on how does that process works in terms of cooperation with like-minded countries when you're trying to do the due diligence and tracking of compliance when it comes to forced labor. I'm thinking work that may happen along with the United States officials, European Union, etc.
Madam Chair, this is certainly an issue of importance in our international dialogues and in our diplomacy. It's an issue that is talked about frequently at the OECD amongst like-minded. It's an important issue there. It's an important issue at the United Nations, where there are bodies, including an annual UN Human Rights Forum that Canada attends. So it is an ongoing topic of conversation, including with, you mentioned the European Union. And in terms of operational cooperation, I believe CBSA has very vigorous relationships with partners.
Yeah, maybe President, I'll just supplement that quickly. In terms of our cooperation with the U.S. As well as Mexico, I think I testified earlier, there are ongoing conversations related to forced labor where there's technical exchanges and information exchanges under the rubric of CUSMA cooperation. Bilaterally as well with the U.S., there's specific information sharing, and we have been hosted by our U.S. colleagues in their forced labor targeting center in New Jersey, I believe it was last year, in order to better understand how they're using the information that they are able to get on their supply chains in order to affect effective targeting at the end of the day on goods coming into the U.S. economy.
Thank you. Mr. Atchison, going back to you, you talked about the multilateral engagement on this issue, and there are ongoing conversations within the United Nations framework and OSCE that you mentioned. Can you highlight for us what are some of the policy concerns that are raised internationally, and what kind of discussion taking place in terms of trying to figure out policy solutions in a multilateral framework to deal with issues around forced labor?
Madam Chair, that is a very good question because it is such a complex issue that is facing the international community because you run into questions of sovereignty and enforcement. And there is only so much you can do as a country when products are arriving on your shores that come from elsewhere. I think another challenge that various governments have expressed, I certainly have heard this from some European like-minded, is balancing the challenges that we're all facing, the headwinds that we're facing in our economy, and our efforts to grow our economy, and conversely, the need to potentially consider various regulations that do come with costs to both businesses and consumers. So I would say that balancing act is something that many governments around the world have considered and discussed.
How much time do you have, Madam Chair?
6 seconds.
56 seconds. And so is there some issues have some regular rhythm to it where there are plenary sessions, there's policy proposals that are continuously being advanced. Is the issue serious enough to see that kind of level of engagement and work towards some sort of an understanding protocol regime internationally so that countries, especially countries that are allies, have similar systems in place, can share resources to cramp down on forced labor?
Madam Chair, there's often discussions about the need to have a consistent approach because there is no sort of uniformed approach. And one of the things we hear from the business community is that there be consistency, that they not be asked to adhere to different regulations and different territories. So certainly at the OECD, this is an ongoing conversation. But at this point, I would say it's mostly technical. It has not risen to a high political level in terms of negotiating a multilateral understanding or anything of that nature.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, alors,
My first question to the agency to begin with. I tabled C-251. I know your work is in the area of enforcement and not in making recommendations, but there's an article 100.1 that talks about a mandatory detention of shipments for certain regions and entities. You discussed this earlier, but that's until there can be evidence that there's been no forced labor. This is an issue. If we had a similar law, what would be the operational capacity at the agency? What would you need to strengthen its capacity in order to comply with this? How about laboratories, additional personnel, etc.?
Thank you very much for the question. Not my position to necessarily comment on laws that are in front of parliamentarians for consideration. I would say, generally speaking, as a border agency, there are several principles in terms of good management of the flow of goods that I think I can speak to. First one, obviously, would be to ensure that there is a degree of understanding in terms of what is or is not allowed into the country. I think that the ability to ensure there's a degree of pre-border or post-border work so that we're not always working at the choke point of the border itself is a good principle. And I think understanding data, as we previously testified, is an important component of that. So,
un changement législatif. Je dis bien advenant. Je demande.
I'm not asking for you for recommendations, but should there be an act where it called for mandatory detention of goods coming from certain regions where we suspect that there's forced labor while waiting for the proof of this? Is there something that we need to strengthen in terms of, let's say, warehouse capacity?
Madam President, I think it's a very difficult hypothetical question to answer. It's uncertain how many goods would be detained. Therefore, the amount of goods would obviously impact the amount of space that's required, and it'd be very difficult for me at this point to comment on that. But space would obviously be a question or concern that we'd have to think about.
Puis fini? Non, elle aurait été plus longue un peu, mais.
My question would have been a bit. How much time do I have?
I'm trying to give you a little bit more time. Do you have a pressing question that you need to get?
Elle va être plus longue que ça, fait qu'on va attendre.
The question won't be longer than my first one, so I'll wait for the next round.
All right, because at the moment I have Mr. Chambers and then Mr. Fonseca, and then depending on how the committee wants to deal with the balance of time. So, okay, Mr. Chambers, 5 minutes for you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Thank you for coming to committee, and welcome back. My understanding is you've had 4 ministers in 5 years. Is that about right? In the department? 4 public safety ministers in 5 years, is that right?
Could be. I'm not sure. I'm not counting.
Well, my point, like every time there's a new minister, there's a new, they have to find out what the departmental priorities are. My sense is that the reason there hasn't been as much enforcement being done is because it's like not a political priority for the government. You don't have to answer that because I know it's not your place. But when you have 4 ministers in 5 years and you compare us to other jurisdictions, like there's something there that's not quite aligned, whether it's institutional capacity or something not coming down from the top. Have any of you been in a meeting with the minister where forced labor has been brought up?
Madam Chair, I'm not a frequent briefer of the minister on any topic, and nor have I briefed him specifically on this one.
Are you aware of any briefing with the minister where forced labor has been brought up?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I'm not privy to the briefing schedule and cycle that he has, and so I wouldn't want to testify. I personally am not aware, but that is not to say that is not the case. I do not have a full visibility on his calendar of briefings.
Right, but I mean, if you've been sent here to the committee to talk about forced labor, I would have assumed that you would know what's happening in the department on forced labor or when that's being discussed with the minister. Is that?
I'm sure we've certainly provided information notes within the system where they go and who they're briefing to. I really couldn't comment on any advice that's been provided to the minister or any documentation that may or may not have made it to his desk.
Okay. But to your recollection, you're unaware of.
I'm not personally aware of any.
That's fine. I noticed in the departmental report or the strategic plan, it talks about some relationship you have with ESDC. I won't ask you to explain that here today, but I would request that you provide in writing to this committee, if possible, how you interact with ESDC, and then a list of the other departments that it says that you also interact with on forced labor across the government. And then finally, how many reports did you get last year from ESDC about concerns that were flagged? Is that something that you could provide the committee?
We can certainly provide that back from the committee. I would just very quickly sort of say I did respond on the briefing to the minister in my capacity as CBSA, but the minister himself obviously has a portfolio, including my colleague who works for public safety proper, and so would consider my answer just a partial answer and not a whole answer. There may be other things in the system as well.
Okay, well, we'll wait for anyone in the department to tell us when's the last time they briefed the minister on forced labor. I'll yield the rest of my time to my friend in the block. Merci.
Merci. Là, il m'en reste combien à peu près? Là, je vais le savoir.
So how much time do I have?
And we'll give you 150 because we've just talked for a second. So
C'est bon, c'est bien gentil, trop généreux de votre
That's
part.
very generous on your part. My question is for GAC. We know that the U.S. says openly, when we talk to representatives, they say that Canada is a weak link in the chain when it comes to bans on forced labor. Do you think that is this a geopolitical game between the U.S. and China? Do you fear and do you believe that this perception is hurting our trade relationship with the United States and has an impact on the Americans' trust in us?
Madam Chair, the committee may appreciate that I'm not in a position to comment on the United States' policies or the reasons for those policies.
Écoutez, vous me forcez à retrouver une autre question.
So you're forcing me to come up with another question. I thought there would be a much lengthier response, but I would like to ask you why Canada is so tardy in adopting measures of reasonable diligence. Why are we lagging behind other countries?
The member speaks to the important role parliamentarians have in terms of the legislative agenda, and we're not in a position to comment on the legislative agenda.
J'en aurai une dernière, ça va être une tentative. Là, ça va être pour la...
I have a question for public safety. Once again, I'm not asking you to say whether you're in favor or not of the bill that I've put forward, but the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness would be in charge of designating risky nations and to come up with a list of problem areas based on the American model and review the list every 5 years. Do you feel, and I'm asking you objectively, I don't want you to say whether you're in favor or not of this, would your department have the ability to do this?
Sorry, I was just waiting for the translation. Madam Chair, this is something that I can't comment on at this time. We would need to assess, sorry, just to follow that, we would need to assess any authorities.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Fonseca, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I may have some extra time at the end where I'll cede some of that time to Simon Pierre. My questions are, with those 48 shipments that we had coming in, the importers of that material, are those importers red flagged? The importers that were importing the material that was coming in those 48 shipments?
So the basis for those detentions would have been the exporter or the supply chain. It would not have been the importer. The detention would have taken place regardless of who the importer was. Moving forward, if goods were detained, were found to have been to have incorporated forced labor, so those goods are prohibited. At no point does that necessarily mean the importer is red flagged. The exporter, that supply chain is. So if that importer were to try to bring in more goods from that same exporter, from that same supply chain, yes, there's a high degree of certainty those goods would be detained a second time, but not necessarily as a function of who the importer is. It's who the exporter is, who the supply chain is, the fact that there's forced labor in that supply chain. The importer itself really doesn't have a role necessarily in terms of risking.
Although the importer may be importing again from that same region.
Exactly.
And there may be a high likelihood of that.
So it may be something we would look at if there's a lot of hypotheticals, but if an importer has a history of importing from a given region or given entities, and those entities have been identified as having forced labor within their supply chains, yes, there's a high likelihood those goods would be detained, but it's not necessarily a function of who the importer is. It's a function of what those supply chains are and who they're buying from.
And so once those ships have been released and they're off to another port, do they go back to their home port where the material came from, or are they trying to transship through some other port? And is there a network where everybody is informed about this particular ship?
This is with respect. I assume this is with respect to the shipments that were re-exported after having been detained. In that case, generally we are able to share information with with our closest partner, our largest land border with the United States. If the goods are being exported somewhere else to another, offshore, overseas, we generally don't have any information as to the ultimate destination of those goods, so we're really not able to do any sort of liaison work. So it's really the goods have left Canada. We know they're not going to the United States. Where they end up, it's not necessarily within our sphere of knowledge.
So there's no global sharing?
No, there's no global network for sharing information of that nature.
And when one of those ships arrives, like we see these large ships, they're filled with hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many containers are on these ships. So how would you find this material? So you would randomly open up one of the containers, you look into what's in there, and then start to see if it's come from a particular region. And
no, essentially, much like any other, much like a number of the pieces of legislation we administer, we receive advanced information with respect to commercial goods coming into the country. We're able to identify what's coming in before it arrives and make the arrangements necessary to detain the specific material, specific goods that we're looking for within a much larger shipment or series of shipments.
And that whole ship, it's not like every container would have that type of material. They can have all sorts of containers that have come from different sectors, different industry. Is it the whole ship, or is it just a particular container or a number of containers?
So this is where it's not necessarily a marine ship that's being detained or the goods on a marine ship. So at times goods can arrive via air or even via land if it's been redirected from the United States. But when it comes to marine shipments specifically, it's the specific goods that are detained, not everything on a ship, not even necessarily everything within a shipping container. It's only the goods that we're looking at, those specific that specific commodity, those specific goods. I'm trying to find a synonym I can't.
So 90% of that ship could be unloaded?
Provided that 90% of the ship contains something other than what we're looking for, what we've targeted, then yes.
Okay. All right, Simon Pierre? Yep, about a minute.
Seconds, but because this is your study, go ahead. You have 2 minutes.
Ben, écoutez, non, mais c'est mon Dieu, c'est très gentil encore une fois.
Once again, very nice of you. I have asked my questions, but I'm under the impression. I'm not reproaching you, but we're not getting all these answers. I understand you can deal with what comes under your purview. I don't think that I have lots of questions that I asked you, and I wasn't asking you whether you were in favor of it or not, but whether you would be able to go ahead with a given measure. Do you have the staff? Do you have the resources? But even though I specified that I wasn't asking you to take a position on this, you didn't want to make any, you didn't really want to answer, so I don't think there's any point in me asking any more questions.
Chair,
Yes.
I feel like there was a question there that I would be happy to answer.
Please do.
In my experience, particularly when we're dealing with proposed government legislation in which the public service would be supporting the preparation of that legislation, there's very intensive analysis done on the potential costs and resources required to implement a new course of action or a new legislation. I think that anytime the government or private members are considering legislation, it is essential to look at what the costs would be to government operations to implement an effective piece of legislation.
Je vais en avoir une bonne, justement. Vous me donnez une idée pour la suite.
You're giving me an idea here. On 2 occasions, the budget of states that there will be a similar law to the one that I tabled a few weeks ago. So reverse onus of proof, giving a mandate to the department to establish certain criteria. And this list of entities that you have to identify, and this was back by the end of 2023, there would be a presentation. Same thing for March 2024. And the other budget said by the end of the year there would be a legislation on that. This hasn't happened. Have you been consulted on this? When you bring forward legislation, you have to consult because the government seemed to be prepared to go ahead with it. Did they talk to you about anything that's coming? And anybody can answer.
For any piece of proposed government legislation, there's a very rigorous process that is undertaken in terms of policy approval by cabinet, funding decisions by the Minister of Finance, etc. I'm not in a position to comment on those discussions in the last government, but suffice it to say that any legislation or government action that is considered does go through a rigorous process of considering all of those elements.
Madame Esdale et puis les gens de
Ms.
l'agence.
Isdale, and has the government said that there's soon going to be legislation on the horizon?
Madam Chair, I wouldn't want to speculate in terms of advice that may have been provided to a previous government. I'll just leave it at that.
The committee members, it's 8 minutes to 5. Does anyone have any further burning questions that they would like to ask our witnesses?
Madam Chair, I do have one. Actually, really quickly. This involves the auto thefts that we see in Canada. What I've understood, the organized crime puts on whatever documentation for export, it will say mattresses, and then they'll fill these, and the container will be filled with cars. Container gets shipped out to Africa or wherever it goes with these cars. How is that stopped? So we have got, I know this doesn't have to do with forced labor, but I did want to ask the question, how does that happen? So how do our ports allow for some of these putting, and in that case, on the forced labor, could that not be happening also from other countries where they're putting on whatever documentation that, it's not what's in the container? And how many containers are actually checked, or how do you know what is in a container? When you've opened up containers, what have you found? Have you found that the product that is on the documentation is not the product that actually is in the container?
Madam Chair, it's a interesting question. I know Alex is on the trade compliance side and less so on the enforcement side. There are challenges with export as well, in the sense, Mr. Lawton testified earlier about the advanced information that the CBSA is provided in terms of advanced commercial information before shipments are arrived. It's that basis that we use for targeting. For shipments that are leaving Canada, I think the members can appreciate anyone that's driven up to the U.S. border, for example, they don't phone ahead to say that they're coming, and you can just present and you can export, which provides challenges with respect to doing the same level of targeting in order to look at shipments on the way out. I think SECU was studying in clause by clause Bill C-12 earlier this week. There are a number of measures that are proposed in there that are designed to assist the agency in terms of strengthening its capacity to do export-related examinations, and I provided testimony to that earlier this week. I would invite the member to look at that in terms of some of the activities the agency is doing in order to strengthen its ability to target exports, including those that are misdeclared to the agency, as he mentioned, is possible.
Very much. Mr. Mantle?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Based on the testimony we've heard, I think members are seized of this issue. So my question is actually to the clerk to inquire into whether our request to have the minister appear has been sent, and if it has he received a response?
Yes, the minister has been invited. I am still waiting on a response.
Everybody's good? All right. Thank you very much. You gave us an hour and a half, and I know it's pretty interesting times. So an important issue that we all care very much about. So thank you for your patience and your time. And who knows, we may have you back soon on some other issues that we're dealing with. So thank you very much.